Potatoes are an important crop in many vegetable gardens, especially here in Ireland, and it is one of the few staple crops that it is relatively easy to become self-sufficient in, to have lots of potatoes to eat all year round, if you have lots of space to grow them in. But if you don't have lots of space to grow them in, and a place to store the harvest, I think it makes more sense to grow a smaller crop of high-value early potatoes. It can be worth growing even a few plants in small gardens to be able to harvest these delicious early potatoes in early summer, and they can generally be harvested in time to get another crop in for the second part of the growing season. And that is why I have generally only grown one early variety of potatoes in 5 of the gardens that make up this Red Gardens project. And this year, the harvest from these early potatoes has been quite good, with a few issues I'd like to improve on, and it was really interesting to see the differences between the same crop grown in 5 different gardens. In 3 of the gardens, we used a more traditional method of planting the seed potatoes at the base of one long trench, which was gradually filled in as the plants grew, in order to earth up or bury the base of the stems and prevent sunlight reaching any of the developing potatoes. In the polyculture garden, they were planted in a small depression in the soil, and only slightly filled in later in the spring to reduce damage to the roots of the other intercrop plants. This less invasive method worked quite well, with only a few potatoes in a few plants developing the poisonous green patches, and I suspect that I may be digging an unnecessarily deep trench in the other gardens, at least for this variety of potato. In the no-dig garden, the seed potatoes were placed in a small hole with the top of the potato roughly level with the surface of the compost layer, and then we added more compost to form a pile at the base of each plant as they grew to provide the needed protection from the sun. This additional compost was added in 3 separate occasions as the plants grew, adding almost half a bucket of compost per plant, which is equivalent to a layer of 50 millimeters or 2 inches if spread out over the full bed, in addition to the 25 millimeters of compost that was added at the beginning of the year, which is a lot of compost. This method worked for the most part, but as the plants began to die back, the rains began to wash away some of the pile of compost, and the local blackbirds dug away at it some more in search of worms, exposing some of the potatoes to the sun. I planted the potatoes into the enclosed space of the Polytunnel Garden in the middle of January, but I waited until the 3rd week of March to plant the seed potatoes into the ground in the 4 outside gardens. This is the traditional time for planting early potatoes here in Ireland, but I find that I usually need to provide protection from frost for these early plantings here in the Midlands. I had covered all of the plants outside for most of the spring until the risk of frost had passed, using multiple layers of horticultural fleece and a more robust crop cover, a combination that I found works quite well to keep in the warmth, and it stands up quite well to the strong winds that we can get. In some of the gardens, I used hoops of wire or pipe stuck in the ground to hold the material up off the leaves of the plants. This worked quite well to prevent frost damage on most of the leaves, but as the plants grew larger in this sheltered microclimate, the hard frost that we had in May did cause some damage to the leaves that had pressed up against this material. But the plants had fully recovered from this damage a few weeks later when the risk of frost had passed and the weather warmed up enough to remove the coverings. I started digging up the plants to harvest the potatoes from the Polytunnel Garden at the beginning of May, and continued to harvest from the long row of plants until the end of June, and then started harvesting from the batches of plants grown outside from the beginning of July. I could have started harvesting from the outside gardens earlier, though the yield from each plant that I dug up would have been lower, and I continued to harvest as needed from these 4 gardens until the 1st week of August. By this time, the plants had started to die back and probably would not produce a lot more, so I dug up all the remaining plants and stored the potatoes until needed. The average yield from each potato plant was different across the 5 gardens, partially because different amounts were harvested at different times earlier in the season when the tubers were still developing quickly. But if I only looked at the yield per plant of the final large harvests and extrapolate to what the full crop would have been at this time, then a more relevant comparison can be made. The yield from the intensive garden was lowest, with just over 1 kilogram from each plant, but the harvest from the no-dig garden was about double that, and the other 3 gardens in between. But because there was almost twice as many plants per square meter in the intensive garden, the overall yield from approximately the same area within the 2 gardens was actually fairly similar. The difference in spacing or density of the plants is the significant factor here, and there seems to be a direct relationship between the amount of space each plant has to grow in and the amount of potatoes it can produce, which makes a lot of sense. The polytunnel garden follows this basic pattern, but the plants in the extensive garden seem to produce less for the amount of space that they had available, and I think this is because I mistakenly didn't add the mix of organic fertilizer that is used in this garden until the plants had grown for a while, so they may not have had the fertility they needed earlier in the season. And the plants in the polyculture garden produce more than expected, but I think this is largely due to the way that I measured the area for the potato crop within the section of the garden that was shared with other crops. The potatoes were planted in 2 rows down either side of a bed, with broad beans, Brussels sprouts, and kale plants growing down a row in the middle. And if I assume the potatoes only had 2/3 of a bed, then the yield per square meter seems higher than expected. But in reality, the early plantings of these strong potato plants definitely occupied more than 2/3 of the garden bed, but it's really hard to put a number on it, and this is one of the key reasons why it's difficult to compare the yields of individual crops from this polyculture garden approach to the other gardens. In the polyculture garden, the Brussels sprout and kale plants that were transplanted in between the established potato plants did struggle at first, lagging behind their counterparts in the other gardens, but started to catch up as the potato plants reached the end of their phase of rapid growth. A lot more care was needed in digging out these potatoes in order to reduce the damage to the roots of the brassica plants, which would have set them back even further, and I was pleasantly surprised by the number of large tubers in good condition. In the extensive and intensive garden, the potatoes were possibly affected by the rapidly growing courgette and squash plants in the adjacent beds. And there was a surprisingly large number of roots from these aggressive plants in amongst the potatoes that we dug up. I'm not sure how early this root competition would have started or how much of an impact it would have had on the yield, but it is likely that it made the fertility issues of the extensive garden worse. We still dug up a reasonable yield of good quality potatoes from this garden, but it definitely could have been better. The cold frames that were used to shelter the squash and courgette plants in the intensive garden would have caused some overshadowing of the potato plants, but it also offered some shelter from the winds, though the plants seemed to die back earlier. I think the plants may have been stressed with deficiencies in soil fertility, or possibly not enough soil moisture at times, caused by so much competition between the closely spaced plants, and the tubers we dug out were definitely smaller than in the other gardens. The potato plants in the no-dig garden didn't have any significant competition from adjacent crops, and with the wider spacing and abundance of compost, it's not surprising that there was a bigger yield from this garden. And the potatoes were easier to harvest as well, as we only needed to scrape back the pile of compost by hand to unearth the crop, with only a few potatoes partially embedded in the soil below. The plants in the polytunnel garden grew very large in the sheltered conditions, with a reasonable yield from such an early crop, which I think would have been better if there had been more consistent watering. I do find it interesting that early potato plants die back so quickly, but this variety at least seems to have been bred to produce a crop of tubers quickly, but not to be able to grow for the full seasons. There did seem to be some potato blight on a few of the leaves, and a few of the potatoes were rotten in a way that seemed to be blight, though I'm not so certain about this. One of the reasons for sticking with growing mainly early crops of potatoes is to get something to harvest before the risk of blight, which is usually worse later in the season. Although the 4 main crop varieties of potatoes that I'm growing in the simple garden are still growing strong with no sign of blight damage yet. There was some slug damage to the leaves, especially in the intensive garden, but I'm not sure if they were causing the damage or just clearing up of the leaves that were already dying back. Thankfully, there was not much slug damage to the buried crop of potatoes, and part of this is due to not leaving them in the ground for longer than is necessary, and it seems that this variety is more resistant to slug damage than a variety I grew a few years ago. And we're also getting better at clearing the slug population out of these gardens. There was some scab on the potatoes, which seems to be common in the alkaline soil that we grow in, and it was worse in a few gardens compared to the others. I don't know what contributed to this difference, apart from perhaps not keeping the soil consistently moist during the dry periods that we had. Growing only one variety of new potatoes in all these 5 gardens makes sense in terms of comparing the different growing methods, and it is easier and cheaper to buy in one 25-kilogram bag of disease-free seed potatoes. Of course, it would be even cheaper to set aside enough of this year's crop for growing next year, but that would increase the risk of blight and other diseases being carried over, removing that consistent baseline start that is useful in this comparison. But Brexit has become a serious barrier in our ability in Ireland to be able to import disease-free seed potatoes, which are normally produced in Scotland. And it makes sense for me to hold back some of the potatoes that I harvested this year for growing next year, just in case my usual supplier can't import enough seed potatoes for sale next year. I really like the taste of this variety that I've been growing when it is still young and small, but I'm not as fond of the flavor when it has been harvested later for storage. It would be good to be able to grow a number of different early and mid-season potato varieties, each one maturing slightly later than the others, so that we have a better chance of harvesting really good quality potatoes that are at their prime for a longer period during the growing season of the summer and autumn. Harvesting some of the crop later in the year will reduce the chance of getting another late-season crop into the ground after the potatoes, which is a definite benefit with growing a very early crop. But I would expect the yields to be better with late maturing varieties, and there would be less of a need for storage, though I would need to be mindful of the increased risks of blight and slug damage. I would also like to adjust the planting densities or spacing of the plants and how they can fit into the fixed bed width, and to not plant them so deep to make harvesting easier. But this season, I did appreciate the convenience of buying in and planting a big bag of early potatoes, and to be able to harvest loads all at once for sharing with our neighbors and to store enough for ourselves, at least until the large batch of main crop potatoes is ready to harvest from the simple garden. And hopefully the blight resistance of these main crop potato varieties will hold out for at least another few weeks, as it looks like it's going to be a really big yield with more than enough to store. This will keep us well fed with potatoes right through the winter and into the spring, at least until the first of those delicious early potatoes is ready to harvest from the polytunnel again in April or May next year.